You can talk.
Well, it was a fairly remarkable time. It was kind of a new sort of enlightenment, a maritime enlightenment for the world. You had Columbus finding America. Of course, he didn't know he found America, but three fairly remarkable voyages. And in no time at all, they were already establishing towns and forts and cities and mines and commerce. Of course, Vasco da Gama, circumnavigating Africa. He's going around Africa on the Cape of Good Hope. And this necessitated new explorations in the science of navigation. And I think that's some of the most amazing stuff that we find today is what few pieces are left of those times. But they were building on knowledge that had been accumulated by the Chinese, by the Vikings, by Mediterranean peoples for all these years, much of which had been forgotten and had to be rediscovered. There are a couple of things that are very important about that era of exploration. First of all, the voyages of Columbus and Vasco da Gama, Magellan, Gilbert, Cabot, Hudson. They're the first hints that we have of the North American world and the Pacific world and the South American world the way it was at the time. Their observations were the very first, and really all we have of that period. And while their observations are not particularly neutral at the time, we through their literature and their observations, we know what the world was like. The second thing is that technology. It not only opened up a whole new world for colonization and for business and agriculture and everything else, language, everything changed. But the technologies of things like navigation, the rediscovery of mathematics, the necessity to improve our technology in order to find these new places and to get the benefit from them. When Columbus crossed the ocean, he probably his best navigational tool might have been something like this. We got it from the Arabs. It was called the camel. We call it the quadrant. It's the plumb bob quadrant, and it would be used in conjunction with a string and a plumb bob. There'd be a couple of sighting vanes, and you would simply, on a rolling deck of a ship, you would hold this, you would sight the celestial body, the plumb bob would lie at the proper angle, and you would read it off of this scale. Very few of these exist today, and it was a very simple thing. Of course, it looks like it wouldn't be very precise, but it's worth remembering that Columbus, a remarkable character in his own right, was able to make 3 voyages to the New World and come pretty close to where he intended to go. Of course, he didn't get to India. Wasn't sure where he was, but he did manage to return to the areas that he wanted to explore. By the time of Magellan, which is only a few short years later, it's only another 25 years, then they had, this was a more common item, which was the astrolabe. And the astrolabe works in somewhat the same way. It's a little more precise, if precision is is the word that you could use. But it could be hung. You would sight the vanes on the particular body, and you could line up the holes through these veins, and in this way achieve an angle that would give you a rough idea of latitude. Again, a very rough idea, but at least a little more precise than the plumb bob quadrant. Uh, Things went on like that for a long time, but that was the beginning of modern navigation. And without Magellan's touch, we not only would we not know as much as we do about the world, because he covered, vast areas. He was the first one really to circumnavigate the world, although he didn't survive to reach it home. But they made observations about the Pacific and South America, and places that we had not been able to see up to that time. And he served, of course, as inspiration for later voyages as Drake and other navigators, later navigators, travel around the world. They could build on that knowledge. It's a pretty important time, and I love the idea that we may get back to exploring that time and finding out more about its significance. It's a very important time in the maritime history, particularly of our world.
Can you talk about the longitude issue at the time?
Well, longitude, there was no real precise way of achieving longitude. There were a number of people that had their own ideas how this could be done, and there were a number of theories as to how to achieve longitude, and some of them will hold up for a short period, but not necessarily in a global range. We weren't really able to achieve longitude until we were able to capture a really precise way of telling time, and that didn't come along until Harrison and the invention of the modern chronometer. Of course, today we no longer use mechanical chronometers. I have a couple of them in here. They're still very accurate, but today, where a chronometer of yesterday was an extremely expensive piece of hardware, expensive to the point that most merchant ships early in the 19th century did not have them, and many naval vessels didn't have them. In spite of their availability to the Navy, particularly the British Navy, they were just considered an outrageous expense. Today, you can buy a chronometer for next to nothing, or they're a quartz movement, and you can buy an accurate movement for much less. And of course, today with GPS, very few people even know how to use a sextant now. So, but Harrison didn't come up with a chronometer until well into the 18th century. It wasn't until the early 19th century that the chronometer was being used to any extent. And again, it was only particular ships and particular merchant companies or navies who were willing to spend the money on those instruments. During the Civil War, when Raphael Semmes and some of the Confederate raiders would capture a merchant ship, the first thing they would do was take the chronometers. And Semmes had quite a collection of chronometers on board the Alabama when it was sunk by the Union Navy by the Kearsarge off of Cherbourg, France in 1864. They're still there. They're still down there at the bottom of the English Channel. But if you examine one of those chronometers of the period, the early chronometers, they're a remarkable piece of machinery. I have, like I say, I have a couple in here. The Americans didn't create their first chronometer until 1815. They were always imported from England. And in 1815, we produced our first one. William Bond, actually, in Boston, produced it. It still exists. The Smithsonian, I believe, has it now.
Now going back to the Magellan's circumnavigation, one of the surviving logs was Francisco Alba's, who was a pilot. And in view of the fact that they had a geocentric cosmology view of the universe, which was completely off base, his log was able to determine longitude within a relatively accurate range given the circumstances. Dead reckoning. What do you think the success there was?
Well, of course, they didn't have much to go by. The dead reckoning is very handy if you have some basic information beforehand. They were dealing with a world that was brand new. That's what's amazing about Magellan's voyage. Between Columbus and Magellan, there was very little known about much of the world. We really didn't know the circumference of the world. We didn't know, if you look at a map of the time, or the old Rutters, or sea charts such as they were, they're mostly wildly inaccurate. Much of it is guesswork. You know, really until well into the 1700s, you'll find charts that show major parts of California as an island. The Bering Sea doesn't exist. You know, Japan and China are
Terra Incognito is still alive and well.
yeah, it's still crazy. There's still, and of course the superstitions of traveling the ocean were still very much in force. People were afraid of being eaten by serpents, you know, sea serpents, and great storms, and falling off into voids. You know, there may be voids in the ocean where all the ocean drained into a particular place, and they could get washed into that. It was a tough time. The mariners themselves, that is the masters and the crewmen and the Prince Henry the navigators and the scientists of the time, they were getting a pretty good grasp of what they were dealing with. But the crews, of course, this was always a terrifying experience. It was always the unknown. And these were people who were largely raised on superstition and were under the thumb of the church or of their own particular superstitions, their own sense of cosmology and, you know, how the world and the universe was made up. There were so many things that were unknown, and they were frightened of the unknown. That was an act of incredible courage. And oftentimes these explorers found themselves overturned by their crews. Their crews would refuse to go someplace, refuse to do something. How many expeditions started out with 4 or 5 ships, and only one came through because the others disappeared, or they turned around, or they went off somewhere else on their own hook, and because they were frightened to continue it. Hudson was marooned, essentially cast adrift with his son by his own crew, and somewhere in Hudson Bay, was never seen again. So, you know, Magellan and Cook were both killed in the Pacific by native populations due to misunderstandings. It was a difficult time.
So leadership consisted more of just leading men, but also managing superstitions and,
Yes.
and
Yes.
psychology of the crew.
Yes. And science wasn't particularly trusted by the crew. You know, you could come along as a scientist, and that didn't necessarily save you, because they didn't understand your science. They thought it might be, might be mysterious forces. We talked about the idea of artillery at sea. When artillery first went to sea in the 1400s, with Henry VIII and the Mary Rose, which of course has been salvaged now, and what's left of it has been, and you know, other ships that learned to use artillery, they were generally tended by professional gunners, often master gunners who were essentially mercenaries, and their knowledge was as close to science as most working class people got. And there was always a suspicion that these men were in league with the devil, because these were forces that were not easy to understand. How could you take 3 things, simple things like potassium nitrate and charcoal and sulfur, mix them together and create this explosion? Well, this was amazing. You'd have to be harnessing some evil energy to do that. So, you know, your science would be held in some suspicion by these folks. So you had to have a certain amount of charisma. You had to have a certain amount of what it took to put your foot down and to convince people that you knew what you were doing. Stick with me, stick with my design, and we're going to be just fine. Don't worry about sea serpents; they're not going to bother you. You know, don't worry about those mysterious forces, that a different sky every night, and the sunrise coming up in strange places. And it's all right. We have a compass here. This is, this is
God is on our side.
Sure.
St. Elmo's fire confirms it.
That's right. And the compass, that was something that was just, why would a compass always be pointing north? No, that doesn't make sense. Someday it's going to point south and we're going to get wrecked. No, it's not going to do that. As long as you keep your knife blade away from that compass, you don't put ferrous metal by it, then that compass is going to read somewhere close to right. Somewhere close. We'll be okay. So it requires a certain amount of trust and suspension of disbelief on the part of crews to follow these men. They no matter how brilliant these men were, they couldn't do it alone. What do you think? What do you think, George? Yeah.
It's
Would you like to have gone
modern day magic.
back to meet the King of Spain? Would you like to have seen Ferdinand and Isabella or King Philip V or
But Manuel.